Welcome, dear listeners. Before we get into the story, please share a moment when you felt happy today with me. I care about you and value you. If you'd like to support me, you can buy me a coffee via the link below. Now relax, the story is about to begin. Chapter 1. Dinner. It was the last week of November, and London was breathing under the thickest fog seen that year. The street lamps had been lit early in the evening, their yellow light drifting like ghosts in the foggy air. Looking out the window of 221B Baker Street, even the opposite sidewalk could only be made out as a vague shadow. Sherlock Holmes sat slumped in the leather armchair opposite the fireplace, his eyes fixed on the ceiling. A thin wisp of smoke curled from the pipe in his right hand, filling the room with the scent of tobacco and oak wood. On the side table next to him lay 3 unopened newspapers, a half-drunk cup of tea, and several letters scattered about. None of the letters had been opened. Dr. John Watson sat at the desk by the window, flipping through the pages of a medical journal. Every now and then his eyes drifted to his friend, clearly disturbed by his motionless state. Everyone who knew Holmes knew that when the great detective remained still, he was dangerous. If his mind was not occupied, dark thoughts and harmful habits would take hold of him. "It's been 3 days," said Watson, setting his magazine on his lap. "You haven't left that chair for 3 days. Mrs. Hudson brought the breakfast tray 3 times, and all 3 times it went back untouched." Holmes didn't move. His eyes were still fixed on a spot on the ceiling. "Are there no crimes being committed in London anymore?" Watson continued, a hint of reproach in his voice. "The newspapers are full of murder stories every day. Scotland Yard is as incompetent as ever. But you sit here staring at the ceiling." This time Holmes stirred slightly. He took his pipe from his mouth and blew smoke rings. The rings rose toward the ceiling, passing through each other. "Ordinary crimes, Watson," he said finally, his voice weary and resigned. "Murder out of jealousy, drunken brawls, amateur thefts. A child could solve them. There's nothing to occupy my mind." Watson sighed. He had seen his friend like this before. Holmes's mind was not like an ordinary locomotive. It was a machine that needed to be constantly in motion, one that began to rust when it stopped. And right now, that machine was idling. "Perhaps you should get some fresh air," Watson said hopefully. "A walk outside." Just then there was a knock at the door. First came the sound of the street doorbell. Then Mrs. Hudson's footsteps echoed on the stairs. Holmes's eyebrows lifted slightly, the first movement on his face in the last 3 days. When Mrs. Hudson opened the door, a young man stood behind her. He was in his late 20s, a slender gentleman with a pale face. He wore an expensive but now dishevelled coat. His hair was wet. He must have run through the fog. He held a hat in his hands and twirled it nervously. "I want to see Mr. Holmes," said the young man, his voice trembling. "It's urgent, very urgent." Holmes scanned his visitor without rising from his chair. His eyes darted from the man's shoes to his tie. Watson knew that look well. Holmes was now gathering details in seconds that an ordinary person would take an hour to notice. "Come in, Mr. Caldwell," Holmes said calmly. "Sit down and tell us about the judge's death." The young man stumbled to a halt. His eyes widened. How do you know?" "My name, the judge? I haven't said anything yet." Watson also looked at Holmes in astonishment. His friend's tricks still surprised him, even after all these years together. Holmes stood up with a slight smile. He leaned against the fireplace and placed his pipe on the table. "A simple matter of observation," he said. "Your shoes are covered in the characteristic yellow mud of the Temple area. That's where the lawyers work near the courthouses. The paper hanging out of your coat pocket is in the format of a will. The seal shape on the edge is familiar. The hat you're holding has PC embroidered on the inner band. It's not hard to guess you're Philip Caldwell, as Caldwell is a well-known surname among young lawyers in Temple." Holmes paused for a moment, his eyes studying the visitor's face. "Now let's get to the judge business. There's a black ribbon in your right coat pocket, a funeral ribbon. You have razor burn on your face, indicating you shaved in a hurry this morning. The circles under your eyes suggest you didn't sleep last night. If a lawyer doesn't sleep at night and shaves in a hurry the next morning, it usually means the sudden death of an important client. And a young lawyer's most important client is usually a judge, a career patron. The black ribbon and your agitation suggest that the death occurred last night, and that you suspect it was not natural." Holmes shrugged. "The rest is a matter of deduction." Philip Caldwell collapsed into the nearest chair, his legs trembling. He placed his hat in his lap and took a deep breath. "You know everything," he said in a hoarse voice. "Yes, I am Philip Caldwell. I am the lawyer administering the will of retired Judge Harold Pemberton. I was also his former student. He taught me a great deal, guided me at the start of my career." Caldwell paused, clearing his throat. Last night the judge died at the dinner he hosted at his mansion. Scotland Yard came this morning, investigated, and they said suicide or natural causes. They want to close the case." "But you don't believe that," said Holmes. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. Caldwell shook his head. "I can't believe it, Mr. Holmes, because the judge called me just 2 days before his death. He said he wanted to change his will." Watson sat up. "Change his will?" "Yes. I need to fix some things, Philip," he told me. He didn't give any details. "We rescheduled the appointment for the next day, last night. But he never made it to that appointment, because he died the night before." Holmes narrowed his eyes. His mind had already begun turning those rusty gears. "A will change? Would that affect someone's inheritance share?" Caldwell hesitated. "I don't know the details, Mr. Holmes. The judge only said he wanted to make a change. He didn't say what, but yes, logically, it must have been about the inheritance shares." "Who is in the current will?" "The majority goes to his daughter, Miss Alice Pemberton. The rest goes to various charities and a few former servants." Holmes scratched his chin thoughtfully. Why did Scotland Yard rule it a suicide? What were the indications? Caldwell took a deep breath. "The judge became ill during dinner. There were 6 people at the table, himself included. Everyone ate the same meal, drank the same wine. But only the judge died. Scotland Yard knew the judge had a heart, so they thought it was natural causes, or perhaps he poisoned himself. Hence, suicide." Holmes's eyes lit up. "Was an autopsy performed?" "It was done this morning. The result, strychnine." A silence fell over the room. Watson frowned. Strychnine was a well-known poison. It meant a painful and violent death. "Suicide by strychnine," Holmes said slowly, weighing his words. "Possible, but unusual. People don't usually choose to kill themselves with painful poisons. Strychnine forces the muscles to contract, and the victim writhes in agony for several minutes. To do that to oneself requires great determination." Caldwell nodded. I thought so too. Also, the judge was talking to me about his future 2 days before his death. I need to fix some things, he said. Are those the words of someone planning to commit suicide? Holmes closed his eyes for a moment. He was thinking. Watson recognized the expression on his friend's face. It was the moment when interest was aroused. Who was at the table that evening? Holmes asked. Caldwell pulled a piece of paper from his pocket. It had 5 names written in his handwriting. 6 people, including the judge himself. The other 5 are Dr. Leonard Ashe, the judge's personal physician; Mrs. Catherine Hale, the sister of the judge's first wife; Mr. George Whitfield, a businessman; Reverend Thomas Eversley, the parish priest; and Miss Alice Pemberton, the judge's daughter. Holmes took the paper and examined it carefully. He paused for a moment over each name. These 5 people. What was their relationship with the judge? Caldwell hesitated. I don't know exactly. Dr. Ashe was an old friend of the judge. Mrs. Hale. She was the sister of the judge's first wife, Eleanor. Eleanor died 10 years ago. Fell down the stairs, they said it was an accident. Catherine Hale had been distant from the judge ever since, but she still attended the gatherings. Mr. Whitfield was someone who had a business relationship with the judge. Reverend Eversley was the judge's chess partner. Holmes narrowed his eyes. And the girl, Alice? Alice, a quiet young woman, a Cambridge graduate. I don't know much about her relationship with her father, but from what I've heard, they were distant. Holmes put the paper in his pocket. We'll go to the mansion tomorrow morning, he said in a determined voice. Watson, get ready. We'll need to arrange permission with Scotland Yard, but that should be easy. Lestrade owes me one. Caldwell stood up, hopefully. So you're taking the case? Holmes smiled. It was the first genuine smile of the day. Mr. Caldwell, for 3 days I've been looking for something to occupy my mind in this city. 6 people sat at the same table, ate the same meal, drank the same wine. But only 1 died. That's either a miracle or murder. And I don't believe in miracles. The next morning, Holmes and Watson set off in a carriage toward the banks of the Thames. The fog had lifted a little since the night before, but the sky was still grey, and a damp cold penetrated to the bone. Watson shivered despite his thick coat. Holmes, however, seemed oblivious to the cold, gazing out the window. After passing through the city's crowded streets, the scenery began to change. The buildings thinned out, the gardens widened. As the Thames approached, the smell of water mingled with the air. Finally, the carriage stopped in front of a large mansion at the end of a long gravel driveway. Pemberton Manor was a typical Victorian-era structure, 3 stories high, made of grey stone, with long windows and a pointed roof. The building was not neglected, but it had a cold atmosphere. It was as if the walls were accustomed to keeping the secrets within. A police officer was waiting at the front door. He saluted Holmes upon seeing him. "Mr. Holmes, Inspector Lestrade is waiting for you inside." Holmes nodded and entered with Watson. The entrance hall was large and dim. The crystal chandelier hanging from the ceiling didn't look very bright in the weak morning light. Oil paintings hung on the walls, probably former members of the Pemberton family. Holmes glanced at the portraits but didn't dwell on them. Inspector Lestrade was waiting at the dining room door. He was a short, sharp-faced, nervous, restless man. When he saw Holmes, he wore an expression that was both relieved and uneasy. This dilemma summed up Lestrade's relationship with Holmes. He needed Holmes's help, but at the same time, He didn't like that Holmes was always right. "Holmes," said Lestrade, shaking his head. "I heard Caldwell was looking for you. I was ready to close this case, but, well, maybe it would be worth your while to take a look." "Ready to close it, Lestrade," said Holmes coldly. "The autopsy report says strychnine. A man is poisoned, and you were going to declare it a suicide." Lestrade shifted uncomfortably. The judge had a heart condition. Maybe he couldn't bear the pain. Or maybe, well, old men sometimes make their own decisions. Holmes didn't respond. He opened the dining room door and stepped inside. The room was large, a central fireplace, bookshelves lining the walls, and a long oval dining table in the middle. The table was still as it had been left that night. Scotland Yard hadn't touched it. That was at Holmes's request. Holmes stood in the doorway and scanned the room. Watson waited behind him, notebook in hand. "Watson," Holmes said in a low voice, "record what you see." Then he slowly approached the table. The table was set for 6. At one end of the oval table, in the head position, was the judge's place, a large carved chair. The other 5 chairs were arranged around the sides of the table. Holmes went to the judge's seat first. The plate was still there, a half-eaten portion of lamb. The fork and knife had been carelessly left beside the plate. There was still a little red wine left in the wineglass. "He must have taken ill during the meal," Holmes said to himself. "He couldn't finish his last bite." Watson noted this. Holmes then looked at the chair, his eyebrows furrowed. "Watson, look at that chair. Compare it to the others." Watson looked. The other chairs were close to the table, in the normal dining position, but the judge's chair was at least a foot away from the table, pushed back. "The chair has been pushed back," Watson said. "Yes, when the judge felt ill, he tried to stand up. He pushed the chair back, but he couldn't manage it, probably because the convulsions started. That's how strychnine works. First a feeling of constriction in the throat, then convulsions throughout the body." Holmes began walking around the table. He looked at each place setting, the plate, the glass, the cutlery. "Everyone ate the same meal," he said. "The plate arrangements are similar. There are residues in all the wine glasses. Everyone drank." Then he stopped. His eyes had caught something next to the judge. The napkin. There was a white linen napkin next to each place setting. But the judge's napkin was different from the others. It was folded differently. The other napkins were folded into simple triangles. The judge's napkin, however, was folded into a rectangle. Holmes carefully picked up the napkin. He unfolded it and paused. "Watson," he said in a low voice, "come and look at this." Watson approached. Inside the napkin there were a few things written in pencil. The writing was faint but legible. March 12th, 1885. Watson furrowed his brow. "A date? What does that mean?" Holmes carefully put the handkerchief in his pocket. "I don't know yet," he said, "but someone wanted to remind the judge of this date, or the judge wrote it himself as a reminder. Either way, this date is important." Holmes went into the kitchen. Watson and Lestrade followed him. The kitchen was large and tidy. Stoves, counters, shelves, everything was in its place. An elderly woman sat in one corner, Mrs. Garrett, the head cook. She stood up when she saw Holmes. "Mr. Holmes, isn't it? Mr. Caldwell mentioned you were coming." Holmes bowed politely. "Mrs. Garrett, could you tell me about the menu that night?" The cook thought for a moment. "We started with soup, mushroom soup. Then the main course, roast lamb, mashed potatoes, and vegetable garnish. For dessert, I served apple pie. There was wine too, red wine from the judge's cellar. Was everything served from a single source? Did everyone eat from the same pot? Yes, sir. The soup was in a large pot, and I served everyone with the same ladle. The lamb came on a single platter, and I sliced it. The dessert was the same. Holmes nodded thoughtfully. So if the poison was in the food, everyone should have been affected. That's how it would be, sir. Holmes looked at the counters. His eyes fell on the bowls on a shelf. Soup bowls. Were these the bowls used that night? Yes, sir. Scotland Yard told us not to touch them. Holmes examined the bowls one by one. There were 6 of them. He held each one up to the light, sniffed them, and examined their inner surfaces. Watson noticed Holmes had stopped at one bowl. He was looking at it differently than the others. Holmes, did you find something? Holmes didn't respond. He wiped the bowl with a handkerchief he took from his pocket and sniffed the handkerchief. I'll need to take this bowl to the lab, he said simply. Lestrade objected. This is evidence, Holmes. Scotland Yard's... I'll return it tomorrow, Holmes said firmly. But first, there's something I need to test. Lestrade grumbled but didn't argue. He had learned from experience that there was no point in arguing with Holmes. Holmes turned to Mrs. Garrett. One last question. Who entered the kitchen that night? While the meal was being prepared or before it was served? The cook thought. Before the meal? Well, Dr. Ashe came. He said he wanted to check the judge's diet list. And Miss Alice dropped by. She said she came to water the flowers. Holmes's eyes flashed for a moment, but he hid it. Thank you, Mrs. Garrett. You've been very helpful. By the time Holmes and Watson left the mansion, it was afternoon. The fog had lifted a bit, but the sky was still leaden grey. The carriage was waiting for them. As they got into the carriage, Watson couldn't resist. Holmes, what did you find? That bowl. The date on the napkin. You're seeing something I can't see. Holmes looked out the window. As the mansion grew smaller behind them, he replied, 6 people at the same table, Watson. They ate the same meal, drank the same wine. But only the judge died. That means the poison wasn't in the food or the wine. The poison must have been in something only the judge consumed. But Mrs. Garrett said everything was served from a single source. It was served, yes, but what happened before it was served? The bowls were sitting on the counter. When the cook went to the spice cabinet, they were alone for a few minutes. And during that time, 2 people entered the kitchen, Dr. Ashe and Miss Alice. Watson's eyes widened. So one of them... We don't know yet, Watson. I need to test that bowl first. But if I'm right, the poison was smeared on the inside surface of the bowl. It dissolved when the hot soup was poured in, and the killer, knowing the maid's serving habits, placed the right bowl in the right place. Watson remained silent for a moment. Then he asked, What about that date? March 12th, 1885? Holmes's face darkened. A person's date of death, Watson. And if I'm right, this murder didn't begin last night. It began 10 years ago. As the carriage made its way toward Baker Street, Holmes added one more thing. Tomorrow we will visit the 5 guests one by one. Each has a story, and one of those stories contains a confession of murder. Chapter 2. 500. The next morning, London seemed to have shaken off the fog of the previous day. The sky was still cloudy, but at least the streets were visible. Holmes had risen early, had breakfast, a surprising development for Watson, and was now watching outside from the window on Baker Street. We'll visit 5 people today, Holmes said as Watson entered the room. Each has a history with the judge. Each may have a motive. But motive alone doesn't make a murderer, Watson. Opportunity is needed, and information is needed. Watson took his coffee and sat down in his chair. Where do we start? With Dr. Leonard Ashe, the judge's personal physician, a 30-year friend, and one of the two people who entered the kitchen last night. Dr. Leonard Ashe's office was on Harley Street, one of London's most prestigious medical addresses. The building looked modest from the outside, but inside it was furnished with expensive furniture and thick carpets. A few patients were sitting in the waiting room. They all looked like upper-class people. Holmes and Watson didn't wait long. Ashe's assistant ushered them in immediately, likely because Holmes's reputation opened doors. Dr. Ashe was a man in his 60s with grey hair and a calm face. His eyes were sharp but tired. He was sitting behind his desk. There were piles of papers and medical journals in front of him. He stood up when he saw Holmes and Watson, but did not extend his hand. "Mr. Holmes," he said in a cool voice, "I was expecting you. I heard Caldwell hired you." Holmes bowed his head. "Dr. Ashe, I wanted to ask you a few questions if you're available." "I'm available, but there's not much I can say. Harold's death, tragic, but I don't believe it was murder." Holmes sat down on a chair. Watson did the same, taking out his notebook. "Could you tell me about your relationship with the judge?" Ashe took a deep breath. "We've been friends for 30 years. We met when I was a young doctor. Harold had just become a judge at the time. His family hired me as his personal physician. Since then, I've been both his doctor and his friend." "What was his health like?" "He had a heart condition. It wasn't serious, but it required attention. In recent months, he seemed a bit more tired. He was irritable and restless." Holmes narrowed his eyes. "Irritable and restless. What was the reason?" Ashe hesitated. His eyes darted away for a moment. Watson noticed. "I don't know," Ashe said finally. "Harold didn't share much about his personal life, but lately, it was as if something was bothering him." "Did he mention receiving any threats?" Ashe's face changed. He paused for a moment. "No," he said, but his voice wasn't very convincing. Holmes noted the answer but didn't press further. Instead, he asked another question. "You went into the kitchen that night, didn't you?" Ashe nodded. "Yes, before dinner. I wanted to check Harold's diet list. He needed to reduce his salt intake." "How long were you in the kitchen?" 2 minutes, maybe 3. Mrs. Garrett was with me. We discussed the menu, then I left." "Were you alone with the bowls?" Ashe's eyebrows rose. "With the bowls?" "No, I was concerned with the menu, not the bowls. Besides, Mrs. Garrett was with me the whole time." Holmes shook his head. "One last question. May I see your prescription book?" Ashe's face hardened. "Patient confidentiality, Mr. Holmes. I can't show you that." "The judge is no longer a patient, Dr. Ashe. He's dead." Ashe paused for a moment. Then he shook his head. "Still no. My book contains information about other patients. I can't show it to you without a court order." Holmes stood up. "I understand. Thank you, Dr. Ashe. Perhaps we'll meet again." As they were leaving, Watson whispered to Holmes, "He's hiding something." Holmes shook his head. "Yes, but we don't know what yet. Let's continue." The second visit was in Kensington. Mrs. Catherine Hale lived in a modest apartment. The building was old, but well maintained. The stairs creaked, but the carpets were clean. The woman who opened the door was in her 50s with stern features. There was a pain in her eyes that years had accumulated. She looked Holmes and Watson over, then invited them in. The living room was small but tidy. A photograph hung on the wall, a portrait of a young woman. Watson looked at the photo. The woman appeared beautiful and happy. "My sister Eleanor," said Mrs. Hale, noticing Watson's gaze. "She died 10 years ago." Holmes looked at the photograph for a long time. Then he turned to Mrs. Hale. "Could you tell me about your relationship with the judge?" Mrs. Hale replied with a bitter smile. "Relationship? Hatred is a more accurate word, Mr. Holmes. That man killed my sister." Watson raised his eyebrows. Holmes remained calm. "That's a serious accusation." "It's not an accusation, it's the truth," Mrs. Hale said sharply. "They said Eleanor died from falling down the stairs. They called it an accident. But I know she didn't fall down those stairs. She was pushed." "What are you basing that on?" Mrs. Hale walked to the window. She looked out. "I saw Eleanor a week before she died. She had bruises on her arms. I fell down the stairs," she said, but she couldn't look me in the eye. She'd been telling the same lie for years. Harold was violent towards her, everyone knew it, but no one did anything. Mrs. Hale turned and looked at Holmes. "Who judges a judge, Mr. Holmes? No one. That's why that man went unpunished. For 10 years. Holmes nodded thoughtfully. "Did you tell the police? Back then?" "I did. They didn't listen." "No evidence," they said. "Accident," they said, and the case was closed. "Well then," Holmes said slowly, "why did you keep accepting this man's invitations? If you thought he was so guilty, why did you sit at his table?" Mrs. Hale was silent for a moment. Her eyes moistened, but she didn't cry. "Because Alice was in that house," she said finally. "My sister's daughter, the only thing left of Eleanor. I couldn't leave her alone with that man. I came to every invitation, sat at every dinner, looked at that disgusting man's face, just so I could see Alice." Watson was moved by these words. Holmes, however, kept his emotions hidden. "One last question," said Holmes. "Did you go into the kitchen that night?" Mrs. Hale shook her head. "No, I just waited in the living room. Then we went to the dining room. I never went into the kitchen." Holmes stood up. "Thank you, Mrs. Hale. You've been very helpful." As he walked toward the door, Mrs. Hale called out after him, "Mr. Holmes, if someone really did kill that man, I'd thank that person." Holmes didn't reply. He just bowed his head and left. The third visit was in the city centre. Mr. George Whitfield's office was large and ostentatious. Mahogany desk, leather chairs, maps and paintings on the walls. Whitfield himself was as ostentatious as his office. A large man, red-faced, expensively dressed. When he saw Holmes and Watson, he hesitated at first. "Are you from Scotland Yard?" he asked suspiciously. "No," said Holmes. "I work privately. Caldwell hired me." Whitfield seemed to relax. He invited them to sit down. "The judge's death. A tragic event," he said, but there was little sorrow in his voice. Holmes got straight to the point. "Could you tell me about your relationship with the judge?" Whitfield's face darkened. "I can't call it a relationship. Judge Pemberton sentenced my brother 15 years ago for murder." "Was your brother guilty?" "No," Whitfield said sharply. "Edward was an innocent man. He was in the wrong place at the wrong time, but Pemberton convicted him. And Edward died of tuberculosis after 3 years in prison." Watson looked at the framed photograph on Whitfield's desk. It was a portrait of a young man, probably Edward. "But you attended the judge's hearings," said Holmes. "Why? Did you pardon him?" Whitfield took a deep breath. "I forgave him," he said, but his voice trembled. "At least that's what I say, But he paused. His eyes drifted to his brother's photograph. Holmes pointed at the photograph. A forgiving man doesn't keep his brother's photograph on his desk, Mr. Whitfield. A forgiving man leaves the past behind. Whitfield didn't respond. He just looked at the photo. Holmes stood up. Did you go into the kitchen that night? No, said Whitfield, still looking at the photograph. I was in the living room all night. I only went into the dining room to eat. Holmes nodded. Thank you, Mr. Whitfield. As they were leaving, Watson asked, That man wants revenge, doesn't he? Holmes shook his head. He is, but he has no access to the kitchen, and he has no knowledge of chemistry. He's a businessman, not a scientist. He's on the list, but he's not a priority. The fourth visit was to the neighbourhood church. St. Margaret's Church was a small but charming building. Inside it was dim and cool. Light filtered through the colourful stained glass windows, falling on the wooden pews. Reverend Thomas Eversley was reading a book near the altar. When he saw Holmes and Watson, he smiled and stood up. He was a man in his 50s with a gentle face and warm eyes. Mr. Holmes, what an honour! Please come in. They moved into a small room in a corner. Eversley offered tea. Holmes politely declined. Watson accepted. Could you tell me about your relationship with the judge? Holmes asked. Eversley nodded thoughtfully. Harold was a good man, he said. At least that's how I knew him. We played chess every week. Sometimes we talked about life, about faith. He was a man who carried heavy burdens. Heavy burdens? Yes. In the last few months, he was restless, as if something from his past was troubling him. Holmes leaned forward. Did he confess to you? Eversley laughed. I'm an Anglican priest, Mr. Holmes. We don't hear confessions. But yes, he would talk sometimes. Matters of conscience. About what? Eversley's face grew serious. I can't say. As a priest, I must preserve the trust of my congregation. If Harold told me anything, it stays between us. Holmes didn't press him, but he asked another question. Did Alice Pemberton ever come to you to ask about her father? Eversley hesitated. The question seemed to surprise him. Yes, he said finally. A few months ago, Alice came and asked if her father had something to confess. Of course, I didn't say anything. Holmes's eyes lit up. Thank you, Reverend Eversley. You've been very helpful. The fifth and final visit was to Pemberton Manor. Holmes and Watson arrived there late in the afternoon. The sky was beginning to darken. Winter days were short. They found Miss Alice Pemberton in the garden. She was dressed in black, mourning attire. She was a pale-faced, slender young woman of about 25. Her eyes were intelligent but distant. She was standing at the edge of a flower bed, gathering dry leaves. When Holmes and Watson approached, she looked up. Mr. Holmes, she said in a calm voice, I was expecting you. Holmes bowed slightly. Miss Pemberton, my condolences for your loss. Alice nodded but said nothing. I need to ask you a few questions, Holmes said gently. If you're ready. I'm ready. They sat down on a bench in the garden. Watson took out his notebook. Could you tell me about your relationship with your father? Alice paused for a moment. My father was a difficult man, she said finally. He was cold and distant. He never said he loved me, but I suppose he cared in his own way. What do you think about your mother? Alice's face changed. For the first time, an emotion appeared. Pain, anger, or both. My mother was a good woman, she said slowly. She lived a life she didn't deserve. Holmes listened carefully to this answer. You went into the kitchen that night, didn't you? Alice nodded. Yes, I went to get water for the flowers, for the vases. How long were you in the kitchen? A few minutes. I got the water and left. Did you handle the bowls? Alice frowned. The bowls? No, I just got the water. Holmes shook his head thoughtfully. Then he looked at Alice's hands. Watson looked too. There was a slight redness on the fingertips of Alice's right hand, as if she had touched something and left a mark. Holmes noticed this, but didn't pursue it. He just filed it away in his mind. One last question, said Holmes. You asked Reverend Eversley if your father had something to confess. Why? Alice's face froze. She was silent for a moment. I was curious, she said finally. My father had been restless lately. I wondered why. Holmes stood up. Thank you, Miss Pemberton. Perhaps we'll meet again. Alice bowed her head but said nothing. As they left the mansion, evening had fallen. As the carriage took them to Baker Street, Watson was deep in thought. 5 people, he said finally. It seems each has their own reason. Holmes nodded. Yes, Dr. Ashe is hiding something, probably related to the violence against the judge's wife. Mrs. Hale clearly hates him and doesn't even try to hide it. Whitfield says he forgives him, but his eyes crave revenge. Eversley is keeping a secret, the priest's trust. And Alice. Holmes paused. Alice what? Watson asked. Alice might be the most dangerous, Watson. Quiet, intelligent, controlled. That mark on her fingers. It's not the kind of mark you'd expect on the fingers of a Cambridge chemistry graduate. Watson frowned. Are you suspecting her? Holmes looked out the window. I'm not accusing anyone yet. But we're going back to the kitchen tomorrow. I need to find out how the poison was administered. Motive alone doesn't make someone a murderer, Watson. Opportunity is needed, and I'll find out who seized that opportunity. As the carriage approached Baker Street, Holmes added, and that date, March 12th, 1885. I need to investigate that date. Someone died on that date. And that death is connected to last night's murder. Watson closed his notebook. A complicated case. Holmes smiled slightly. My favourite kind, Watson. My favourite kind. Chapter 3. The Bowl. As the first light of dawn filtered through the windows of Baker Street, Holmes was already up. When Watson came downstairs, he found his friend at the laboratory table. Glass bottles, pipettes, and chemical reagents were arranged on the table. In the middle sat the soup bowl brought from Pemberton Manor. Didn't you sleep last night? Watson asked as he took his coffee cup. Holmes didn't look up. Sleep is a waste of time, Watson. At least for now. This bowl is telling me something, but I haven't quite figured out what yet. Watson approached the table. The bowl looked ordinary. White porcelain, blue-lined edges, a typical piece of Victorian tableware. What are you looking for? Holmes held the bowl up to the light. He examined the inner surface carefully. Look here, he said, pointing to a spot on the bowl. This isn't on the others. Watson looked. On the inside surface of the bowl near the bottom, there was a slight dullness, as if something had been smeared there and dried. What could this be? Holmes placed the bowl on the table and took a piece of cotton. He lightly moistened the cotton and wiped that area of the bowl. Then he placed the cotton in a glass tube and poured a few drops of reagent onto it. A few seconds passed. The liquid in the tube changed colour, first yellow, then orange. Holmes's eyes lit up. There it is, he said. Strychnine. It was smeared onto the inside surface of the bowl while dry. When hot soup was poured in, it dissolved and mixed into the liquid. Watson looked at the bowl in horror. So the killer had already applied the poison to the bowl before the meal? Yes, and only the judge's bowl. The other 5 bowls are clean. I checked them all yesterday. This means the killer knew which bowl would be served to the judge. Watson frowned. But how could they know? The bowls are identical. How could they tell them apart? Holmes stood up and took his coat. That's what we'll find out today. We're heading back to the manor. I need to speak with the maid. When they arrived at Pemberton Manor, it was 10 o'clock. The sky was cloudy, but there was no fog. The manor looked less gloomy in the daylight, but it still had a cold feel to it. Holmes first found Inspector Lestrade from Scotland Yard. Lestrade was waiting in the manor's hallway, standing with a bored expression. "Holmes," said Lestrade, "the autopsy report is in. It's officially strychnine poisoning, but I still say it's suicide." Holmes took the report and skimmed it quickly. "Suicide, Lestrade? How many people do you know who have committed suicide with strychnine?" Lestrade shrugged. "People do strange things." "Strychnine is a painful poison. The muscles spasm, the body convulses, the victim suffers for minutes. No one would want to do that to themselves. If he wanted to commit suicide, he would have used opium or arsenic, quick and painless." Lestrade couldn't respond. Holmes put the report in his pocket and walked into the kitchen. "Where's the maid? Mary?" "She should be in the kitchen," Lestrade said from behind him. The kitchen was just as it had been left yesterday. Mrs. Garrett was stirring something over the stove. The young maid Mary was drying dishes in a corner. Both of them paused when they saw Holmes. "Mary," Holmes said gently, "can I speak with you for a few minutes?" Mary looked at him with frightened eyes. She was a slender, pale girl of 18 or 19. She put down the plate she was holding and stepped in front of Holmes. "Yes, sir?" Holmes sat down on a stool so he was at eye level with the girl. He didn't want to appear threatening. "Did you carry the plates that night, from the kitchen to the dining room?" Mary nodded. "Yes, sir, I always carry them." "How do you carry them? Can you describe it?" Mary thought for a moment. "I put them on a tray, 6 bowls on a large round tray. Then I take them to the dining room." "How do you arrange the bowls on the tray? Is there any particular order?" Mary shook her head. "Always the same way, sir. Clockwise. I start from the left side of the counter and place them clockwise on the tray." Holmes's eyes lit up. "And when you place them on the table, which bowl goes to whom?" "I start at the head of the table, sir. The judge always sits at the head. I place the first bowl for him, the top bowl on the tray." Watson was taking notes. Holmes continued. "So the top bowl on the tray always goes to the judge?" "Yes, sir, always." Holmes stood up. "Thank you, Mary. You've been very helpful." Mary looked relieved. Holmes now turned to Mrs. Garrett. "Mrs. Garrett, who arranged the bowls on the counter that night?" The cook thought for a moment. "I did, sir. I always do. I put the soup in the pot and arranged the bowls on the counter." "What did you do after arranging the bowls?" "I went to the spice cabinet. I needed to add a little more salt to the soup. The cabinet is in the other corner of the kitchen." "How long were you gone?" Mrs. Garrett thought. "A few minutes, maybe 5 minutes. I found the salt, added it, and stirred it in." "Who entered the kitchen at that time?" Mrs. Garrett narrowed her eyes, trying to remember. "Dr. Ashe came in. He asked about the judge's diet list. I explained the menu to him." "Was Dr. Ashe alone with the bowls?" "No, sir. When I returned, he was still here. We talked together, then he left." "Who else came in?" Mrs. Garrett paused. Miss Alice. She said she came to get water for the flowers, for the vases. How long did Alice stay? I don't know, sir. I was in the spice cabinet. When I came back, Alice was filling the water. Then she left. Holmes's face grew serious. So Alice was in the kitchen while you were in the spice cabinet. She was alone with the bowls? Mrs. Garrett hesitated. I suppose, yes, she might have been alone for a few minutes. Holmes nodded. Thank you, Mrs. Garrett. Holmes went into the dining room. Watson followed him. 2 people, Watson said quietly. Ash and Alice. Ash didn't have a chance to be alone with the bowls. Mrs. Garrett was with him. Alice, however, was alone for a few minutes. Watson nodded thoughtfully. But is that enough? Could someone poison the bowl in just a few minutes? Holmes walked to the head of the table. Not poison it, Watson. The poison had already been applied. The killer just had to put the right bowl in the right place, on top of the tray. That takes a few seconds. Watson understood. So the killer prepared the bowl beforehand. Maybe hours ago, maybe days ago. Probably. Strychnine becomes invisible when it dries. You can put it on the cup and leave it there and no one will notice. Then you just have to make sure that cup gets to the judge. Holmes looked at the items on the table. The plates, glasses, cutlery were still in place. And the napkins. Holmes took the judge's napkin. It was the napkin he had put in his pocket yesterday, the one with March 12th, 1885, written on it. I need to look into this date, Holmes said to himself. Watson approached. March 12th, 1885. What could have happened on that date? Holmes looked at the napkin thoughtfully. Someone's death. I'd bet on it. And this death is connected to the judge. By the time they returned to Baker Street, it was afternoon. Holmes immediately shut himself in his study and began examining the records. Watson did not disturb him. He knew his friend well in such a state. By evening, Holmes emerged from his room. He held a piece of paper in his hand. I found it, he said. Watson stood up. What did you find? Holmes placed the paper on the table. March 12th, 1885. That's when Eleanor Pemberton died. Judge Harold Pemberton's first wife. According to official records, she fell down the stairs and died. It was closed as an accident. Watson frowned. The death Mrs. Hale mentioned, her sister. Yes. And Mrs. Hale believes her sister didn't die in an accident. She believes she was pushed. Holmes walked to the window. Now think, Watson. Someone wrote this date on the judge's handkerchief. Eleanor's date of death. This is no coincidence. This is a message. What message? Holmes turned around. I know the message. I know what you did. The killer sent a message to the judge before killing him, reminding him of the murder 10 years ago. Watson looked on in horror. So this murder is revenge? Revenge for Eleanor? Holmes shook his head. It seems so, but whose revenge? Mrs. Hale, Eleanor's sister. Alice, Eleanor's daughter. Both of them could want this revenge, Watson thought. But Mrs. Hale didn't have access to the kitchen. She said so herself. Yes, and she had no knowledge of chemistry. But Alice graduated from Cambridge with a degree in chemistry, and she was alone in the kitchen with the bowls. Holmes leaned against the fireplace. Tomorrow I'll investigate Eleanor's death. I need to find the police reports from that period. Watson closed his notebook. A complicated revenge story. Holmes shook his head. The most complex ones, Watson, because revenge requires patience, and patient killers are the most dangerous. That night, Holmes worked late into the night. When Watson went to bed, Holmes was still at his desk, examining records and taking notes. The next morning, when Watson came downstairs, he found Holmes sitting in front of the fireplace. His eyes were red. He hadn't slept, but there was a look of determination on his face. "I found the police records," said Holmes. "The officer who wrote the report on Eleanor Pemberton's death is still alive. Retired Constable Briggs. He lives in Kent." Watson took his coffee. "Will you visit him?" Holmes stood up. "We will, Watson. This journey will be interesting." The train journey to Kent took 2 hours. Holmes was mostly silent, watching the rural landscape from the window. Watson tried to read a magazine but couldn't concentrate. Retired Constable Briggs lived in a small village house. He was a man in his 70s, hunched over with white hair. He was surprised to see Holmes and Watson, but invited them inside. "Sherlock Holmes," said Briggs upon hearing the name. "I've read about you in the newspapers. It's a great honor." Holmes smiled politely. "Mr. Briggs, you were involved in a case 11 years ago. The death of Eleanor Pemberton. Do you remember?" Briggs's face changed. His smile vanished. "Pemberton," he said slowly. "Yes, I remember. Would you tell us about it?" Briggs took a deep breath. He sank into his chair. "She was the judge's wife. She fell down the stairs, broke her neck. It was night time. The judge said his wife slipped. We wrote it down that way." "You wrote that," said Holmes. "But what did you think?" Briggs was silent for a long time. His hands were trembling. "The judge was a very influential man, Mr. Holmes. We were told to close the case quickly. Orders from above." "Who said that?" "My superiors. They told me it was an accident, Briggs. Write the report and close it." Holmes leaned forward. "But you had your doubts, didn't you?" Briggs looked away. "There were bruises on the woman's arms," he finally said. "They didn't match the fall. They were like fingerprints. Someone had held her tightly." Watson looked horrified. "Didn't you write that in the report?" "I couldn't," Briggs said in a bitter voice. "The judge was a judge. I was just a constable. Who would listen to me?" Holmes stood up. "Thank you, Mr. Briggs. You've been very helpful." Briggs looked up. "Mr. Holmes? The judge is dead, isn't he? I read it in the newspaper." "Yes, he was murdered." Briggs shook his head. "They say God's mills grind slowly, but grind fine. Perhaps that's true." Holmes didn't respond. He simply bowed his head and left. The train was quiet as they returned to London. Watson was deep in thought. "So the judge killed his wife," he finally said. "And no one did anything about it." Holmes shook his head. "For 10 years. But someone finally did something. And that someone was probably one of Eleanor's closest associates." "Alice?" Holmes looked out the window. "Alice had the strongest motive. Her mother was murdered. Her father went unpunished. A chemistry degree from Cambridge. Knowledge of strychnine extraction. Left alone in the kitchen with the bowls. Opportunity. And that mark on her fingers." Holmes paused. "I need to search Alice's room tomorrow. And if what I find there proves me right, this case is solved." Watson sighed. "But this is a tragic story, Holmes. A girl killed her mother's murderer. Isn't that justice?" Holmes turned and looked at Watson. "Justice, Watson? Or revenge? These two concepts sometimes enter through the same door, but lead to different places. My job is to solve the murder. Deciding what justice is, that's not my job." As the train approached London, Holmes added, "But first I need to find the evidence. Suspicion isn't enough. I need definitive proof." Chapter 4. Eleanor, The next morning, Holmes went to Pemberton Manor early. This time he was accompanied not only by Watson, but also by Inspector Lestrade. Holmes had obtained official permission to search Alice's room. Lestrade had reluctantly granted it. The mansion seemed even quieter in the early hours of the morning. The servants were going about their work. Mrs. Garrett was preparing breakfast in the kitchen. Alice was sitting in the living room, watching outside from the window. When Holmes entered, Alice turned her head. There was no surprise on her face. It was as if she'd been expecting him. "Mr. Holmes," she said in a calm voice. "Welcome back." Holmes nodded slightly. "Miss Pemberton, I need permission to search your room. This is part of the investigation." Alice paused for a moment. Then she shrugged. "Of course. You can search anywhere you like. I have nothing to hide." This sentence caught Holmes's attention. "I have nothing to hide." It was something innocent, people said. But sometimes criminals said it too, with confidence in themselves. Holmes went upstairs with Watson and Lestrade. Alice's room was at the end of the corridor, a large, bright room. The garden could be seen from the window. The furniture was simple: a bed, a desk, a wardrobe, and a few bookshelves. Holmes looked at the bookshelves first. Most were science books: chemistry, biology, physics, textbooks left over from Cambridge. There were a few novels among them: Jane Austen, the Bronte sisters. Watson checked the wardrobe. Ordinary clothes, morning attire, a few hats. Nothing unusual. Holmes moved to the desk. He opened the drawers one by one. Letters, notes, a few photographs. Most of the photos were from Alice's childhood. One caught his attention. A young woman holding a little girl. The woman was smiling, but there was sadness in her eyes. "Is that your mother?" Holmes asked. Alice was standing in the doorway, watching them. "Yes," she said. "It was taken when I was 4 years old." Holmes examined the photograph carefully. Eleanor was a beautiful woman, dark hair, delicate features, elegant. But Holmes's eye caught something else. On Eleanor's left arm, just above the elbow, there was a faint mark. It could have been a bruise. The photograph was black and white, so it was hard to say for sure. Holmes put the photograph back and continued searching. He found a notebook in the bottom drawer of the desk. It was a thick notebook with a black cover. When he opened it, he saw that it was filled with notes. Chemistry notes, formulas, experiments, calculations. "My university notes," Alice said from behind him, "from my chemistry classes." Holmes flipped through the pages. Most of them really did look like university notes. But one page caught his attention. It was different from the others. It looked newer, the paper was whiter. The page read, "Strychnine, strychnos nux vomica. Dissolution. Hot water or acidic environment. Drying. Spread in a thin layer on a flat surface. Duration of effect, 15 to 30 minutes. Holmes looked at the page, then he turned to Alice. "What are these notes for?" Alice hesitated. For the first time, a look of unease appeared on her face. "For a university assignment," she said. "I was researching poisonous alkaloids." Holmes looked at the date on the page. A small date was written in the upper right corner. May, 1895. 3 years after university. Graduation was in 1892, wasn't it? Alice didn't respond. Holmes put the notebook in his pocket. "I'm taking this as evidence," he said. "Inspector Lestrade, please make a note of it." Lestrade took note. Alice's face had paled, but she still maintained her composure. Holmes continued searching the room. He looked under the bed, checked behind the wardrobe. Then he noticed something. In the corner of the room, between the wall and the wardrobe, there was a small gap. And in that gap, a door, not hidden but inconspicuous. "Where does this lead?" Holmes asked. Alice hesitated. "To my mother's old room. My father kept that room locked. I know the key." Holmes approached the door. "Will you open it?" Alice hesitated for a moment. Then she took a small key from her pocket and opened the door. Eleanor Pemberton's old room seemed frozen in time. No one had lived here for 10 years, but the room still bore Eleanor's traces. A layer of dust covered every surface. The curtains had faded. The bedspread had yellowed. Holmes entered the room and looked around. Watson followed behind. Alice remained at the door. A portrait hung on the wall, Eleanor's oil painting. It was a beautiful work of art, created by the artist's hand. Eleanor looked young and happy in the painting, probably from the early years of her marriage. Holmes approached the dresser. He opened the drawers. Old clothes, faded handkerchiefs, a few jewellery boxes. Then he found something in the bottom drawer, a hidden compartment at the bottom of the drawer. When he opened the compartment, there was a small notebook inside, a brown leather-bound, worn notebook. Holmes took the notebook and opened it. On the first page was a name written in handwriting: Eleanor Pemberton. My diary. Holmes began turning the pages. Watson approached and looked over his shoulder. The diary was filled with Eleanor's handwriting. The date started in the 1880s, the early years of her marriage. The first pages were happy. A new home, a new life, hopes. But as the pages progressed, the tone changed. Holmes read some sections aloud. June 3rd, 1882. Harold got angry again today. I said something at dinner that he didn't like. He raised his voice. I was scared. August 15th, 1883. I have bruises on my arm. I don't know what to tell Catherine. I'll say, I fell, as usual. I'm tired of lying. February 22nd, 1884. Alice said her first word today. Mama. I hugged her and cried. I must be strong for this child. I must endure for her sake. Watson's face had gone pale. Holmes continued reading. March 10th, 1885. Harold did it again today. I can't take it anymore. I'll write to Catherine. I'll take Alice and leave. But I'm afraid Harold won't let us go. One day he'll kill me. I know it. That was the last entry. 2 days later, on March 12th, 1885, Eleanor had fallen down the stairs and died. Holmes closed the diary. A deep silence filled the room. Watson spoke in a hoarse voice. Good Lord, this woman, she suffered for years. Holmes did not respond. His eyes turned to Alice. Alice was standing at the door, her face as white as a sheet. Her hands were trembling. You knew about this diary, Holmes said. It was not a question. Alice nodded. I found it 2 years ago, she said in a hoarse voice. I was rummaging through my mother's room. I wanted to touch her things and I found this. Did you read it? I read it. Alice's eyes were moist, but she wasn't crying. I read every word, and that day I understood. I understood what my father had done. Holmes put the diary in his pocket. This will be taken as evidence. Alice didn't object. Before leaving the mansion, Holmes wanted to make one more visit. He went to Kensington to see Mrs. Catherine Hale. Catherine was surprised to see Holmes, but she let him in and offered him tea. Again, Mr. Holmes, is there something new? Holmes took his notebook out of his pocket and placed it on the table. Do you recognize this? Catherine looked at the diary. Her eyes widened. She took the diary with trembling hands and opened it. Eleanor's diary, she whispered. My God, where did this come from? Alice found it 2 years ago. Catherine began turning the pages. As she read, her face changed. First shock, then anger, then deep sorrow. I knew, she said finally, her voice breaking. I always knew, but to see this in her own handwriting. Catherine began to cry. Quiet, deep sobs. Holmes waited respectfully. Watson was also silent. A few minutes later, Catherine composed herself. She wiped her eyes. Mr. Holmes, she said, if someone killed that man, I don't blame that person. I can't blame them. Holmes bowed his head. I have one more question. Have you seen this diary before? Did Alice show it to you? Catherine shook her head. No, Alice never showed it to me, but a few years ago, Alice started asking me questions about her mother, about how she died. I told her some things. I shared my suspicions. What did you say? Catherine took a deep breath. I said my sister didn't fall down the stairs. I said she was pushed. I said her father killed her. Holmes shook her head. Thank you, Mrs. Hale. You've been very helpful. As she walked toward the door, Catherine called out behind her. Mr. Holmes, Alice. Alice was a good girl. She was just like her mother. Whatever she did, I understand why. Holmes didn't respond. He just bowed his head and left. The next visit was to the church. Reverend Thomas Eversley smiled when he saw Holmes, but his smile looked tense. Mr. Holmes again, visiting so often. I suppose I should be concerned. This time, Holmes got straight to the point. Reverend Eversley, you mentioned earlier that the judge told you about matters of conscience. Now I'm asking you directly. What did the judge say about his wife's death? Eversley's face paled. Mr. Holmes, I am a priest. The trust of my congregation. The judge is dead, Holmes said sharply, and there's a murder investigation. You need to tell me everything you know. Eversley was silent for a long time. He clasped his hands, unclasped them, clasped them again. Finally he spoke. Harold had been very restless in recent months. He said he couldn't sleep, that he was having nightmares. One night, while playing chess, he said to me, Thomas, there are some sins a man cannot forget. No matter how much time passes, no matter how successful he becomes, those sins remain in his heart. Holmes leaned forward. Go on. I asked, what sins are you talking about, Harold? He said, Eleanor's. What happened that night? He said nothing else, but I'll never forget the look in his eyes. Guilt. Deep, dark guilt. Watson was taking notes. Holmes asked, Did you tell Alice about this? Eversley shook his head. No, but Alice came to me one day, a few months ago. She asked if her father had something to confess. Of course, I didn't say anything, but in Alice's eyes, I saw something. It was as if she already knew, and she just wanted confirmation. Holmes stood up. Thank you, Reverend Eversley. As he walked toward the door, Eversley asked, Mr. Holmes, did the judge really kill his wife? Holmes turned around. Yes, all the evidence points to it. But 10 years ago, no one investigated it. Now, someone has taken justice into their own hands. Eversley bowed his head. May God forgive us all, he said softly. By the time they returned to Baker Street, evening had fallen. Holmes and Watson were sitting in front of the fireplace. Holmes had placed his diary and chemistry notes on the table. Now we know the reason, said Holmes thoughtfully. Alice found her mother's diary 2 years ago. She learned that her father was the murderer. Her Aunt Catherine had already told her her suspicions. Alice went to Reverend Eversley to try to confirm her father's guilt. And then she made her plan, said Watson. Yes, she researched strychnine. The notes show that. She found the rat poison box in the basement storage. She extracted the poison and smeared it on the inside surface of the bowl. Then she placed the bowl in the right spot. Holmes looked at the fireplace. A decade of revenge, Watson. Cold, patient, calculated. Alice didn't rush. She perfected her plan, and then she carried it out. Watson sighed. Holmes stood up. But our work isn't done yet. The evidence I have is circumstantial. The diary suggests a motive, but it's not proof of murder. The chemistry notes raise suspicion, but they're not enough on their own. There are traces on Alice's fingers, but that's not definitive proof either. Watson furrowed his brow. What will you do? Holmes walked to the window. I need to find definitive proof. Alice is a smart woman, a Cambridge graduate. She can't be convicted on circumstantial evidence alone. A good lawyer could tear it all apart. Holmes turned around. I'll use Alice's greatest weakness, her meticulousness. Someone who plans so carefully will want to clean up any traces left behind. But she hasn't done so yet because she thought no one suspected her. Tomorrow, I'll make her feel that I suspect her, and I'll watch what she does that night. Watson understood. You're setting a trap. Holmes nodded. Yes, and if Alice falls into the trap, I'll have irrefutable evidence. Chapter 5. Poison. The next morning, Holmes had risen before dawn. When Watson came downstairs, he found his friend at his desk. Chemistry books, notes, and a map were spread out on the desk. I need to find the source of the strychnine, said Holmes, without waiting for Watson's question. Where did the poison come from? Where did Alice get it? Watson took his coffee and approached the desk. Can't it be obtained from pharmacies, with a prescription? Holmes shook his head. Strychnine isn't sold in its pure form. It's too dangerous, but it's widely used as rat poison. Butler's rat poison, Harvey's vermin killer. There are many brands. The active ingredient in all of them is strychnine. Holmes stood up. We're going to the mansion. I need to search the basement. When we arrived at Pemberton Manor, it was 9 o'clock. Holmes went straight down to the basement. Watson and Lestrade followed him. The basement was dark and damp. The walls were stone, the floor earth. A single gas lamp hanging from the ceiling gave off a faint light. Holmes took a candle from his pocket and lit it. The basement was divided into several rooms: a wine cellar, a coal storage room, and a general storage room. Holmes headed for the general storage room. The storage room was filled with shelves. Old furniture, trunks, boxes, all kinds of household items were piled up. Holmes began examining the shelves one by one. A few minutes later, he found what he was looking for. In the upper corner of the shelf, behind a dusty box, stood a small tin can. The can was labelled Butler's rat poison. Active ingredient, strychnine, keep away from children. Holmes took the box and opened it. It was half empty. There's the source of the poison, said Holmes. Rat poison, strychnine-based. Watson looked at the box. Half of it has been used. But does rat poison require that much? Holmes shook his head. Not for rats. But if you want to extract and concentrate strychnine, you need a large amount of raw material. Alice probably used half the box for that purpose. Lestrade took notes. But anyone could have access to this box, couldn't they? How will we prove Alice took it? Holmes didn't answer. Instead, he went upstairs and found Mrs. Garrett. Mrs. Garrett, what do you know about the rat poison in the basement? The cook thought. There was a rat problem last year, sir. Dr. Ashe wrote a prescription and Mr. Compton, the butler at the time, got the poison. I never went down to the cellar storeroom. Where is the key to the storeroom? It used to be in Mr. Compton's room. But after he retired, the key was put in a drawer in the kitchen. Anyone can access it. Holmes shook his head. This information didn't directly implicate Alice, but it pointed to an opportunity. Holmes's next step was to visit Dr. Ashe. This time there was an official request. An examination of the prescription book, signed by Inspector Lestrade. Dr. Ashe greeted Holmes and Lestrade in his office. His face was tense. "Is this a court order?" he asked, examining the paper. "An official request from Scotland Yard," said Lestrade, "as part of the murder investigation." Ashe sighed and pulled a thick ledger from his desk drawer. The prescription ledger. Holmes began flipping through the pages of the book. Dates, names, medications. Everything was recorded in an orderly fashion. When he reached 6 months prior, he found what he was looking for. May 15th, 1895. Patient, Judge Harold Pemberton. Complaint, rat infestation in the house. Prescription, butler's rat poison, strychnine-based. 1 box. Note, butler. Mr. Compton will receive it. Holmes showed the page to Lestrade. Here it is. Dr. Ashe prescribed rat poison to the judge 6 months ago. Ashe went on the defensive. This is completely legal. There was a rat problem. I wrote a prescription. I didn't handle the application. Holmes continued looking through the notebook. He was searching for something else. And he found it. June 20th, 1895. Patient, Miss Alice Pemberton complaint. Hand eczema, redness on the fingers. Diagnosis, chemical irritation. Note, the patient said it was caused by chemistry work. Ointment was prescribed. Holmes marked the page. What's this, Dr. Ashe? Ashe looked and frowned. Alice came in one day. She had redness on her fingers. She said she was doing chemistry experiments, that she'd touched something. So I prescribed ointment. Chemical irritation, Holmes said slowly. Unprotected contact with strychnine can also cause such irritation, can't it? Ashe's face paled. I didn't think of that. Alice was doing chemistry work. I thought it was normal. Holmes looked at the notebook again. The date was important. June 20th, 1895. A month after the rat poison prescription, and 5 months before the murder. Thank you, Dr. Ashe. This information is very valuable. Holmes wanted to verify Alice's educational background as his next step. He sent a telegram to Cambridge University and received a reply the same day. Miss Alice Pemberton, Newnham College, Cambridge enrollment, 1889. Graduation, 1892. Department, Natural Sciences, Chemistry focused. Degree, First Class Honours Thesis. Topic, the chemical properties and detection methods of alkaloid poisons. When Watson read the telegram, his eyes widened. The thesis topic is alkaloid poisons. Isn't strychnine also an alkaloid? Holmes shook his head. Yes, Alice probably knows more about strychnine than most doctors. She knows how to extract it, how to concentrate it, how to administer it. Watson asked thoughtfully, but that knowledge alone isn't proof of guilt, is it? Knowing something doesn't mean you did it. Holmes walked to the table and pulled out the chemistry notes he'd taken from Alice's room. You're right, Watson. Knowledge alone isn't enough. But look at this. Holmes opened the notes and pointed to a specific page. Watson read, "Strychnine, strychnos nux vomica. Dissolution, hot water or acidic environment. Drying. Thin. Layer on a flat surface effect time. 15 to 30 minutes. I've seen this before," said Watson. "You found it in Alice's room." "Yes, but now pay attention to the date. May 1895. 3 years after Alice graduated from university. If this were a university assignment, the date should have been 1890 or 1891. This note was written long after she left university." Watson understood. "So Alice researched strychnine after graduating, to prepare her plan." Holmes nodded. "Yes, and the date is important. May 1895. The month the rat poison prescription was written. Alice must have learned that Dr. Ashe had written a prescription for rat poison for her father, and she decided to take advantage of this opportunity." Holmes now wanted to complete the final piece of evidence, the mark on Alice's fingers. When he returned to Pemberton Manor, he found Alice in the sitting room. She was sitting by the window, reading a book. When she saw Holmes, she put the book down. "Mr. Holmes," she said in a calm voice. "Again?" Holmes smiled gently. "Miss Pemberton, I have an unusual request, but may I see your hands?" Alice raised her eyebrows. "My hands?" "Yes, just an observation." Alice hesitated for a moment, then she held out her hands. Holmes carefully examined Alice's hands. They were slender and elegant, the hands of a pianist or an artist. But there was something on the index finger and thumb of her right hand, a slight discoloration. A pale yellowish tone and a slight scabbing like a healing burn. "When did these marks form?" Holmes asked. Alice withdrew her hands. "A few months ago, during chemistry experiments, some acid spilled. You went to Dr. Ashe, didn't you? In June." Alice's eyes widened for a moment. Then she composed herself. "Yes, I got some ointment." Holmes turned and went outside, but he stopped at the door. "Miss Pemberton, I'm calling Dr. Ashe. I'll ask him to examine these marks medically." Alice didn't respond. Dr. Ashe arrived at the mansion within an hour. Holmes took him to Alice's side. "Dr. Ashe, I want you to examine the marks on Miss Pemberton's fingers. What kind of chemical contact could have caused these?" Ashe hesitated, but Holmes's gaze was determined. Alice extended her hands. Ashe examined them carefully. He touched the fingers, looked at the discoloration, checked the skin texture. "These marks," Ashe said finally, "don't resemble acid burns. Acid burns are usually more irregular and deeper. These marks seem to have been caused by prolonged contact with an alkaloid substance." "Like strychnine?" Holmes asked. Ashe's face paled. "Yes," he said slowly. "Unprotected contact with strychnine can leave marks like these, especially when handling the poison in its pure form, during extraction or concentration." Alice's face froze. Her hands were trembling. Holmes turned to Ashe. "Can you document this finding in writing?" Ashe shook his head. "Yes, but this isn't a definitive diagnosis. Other alkaloids can leave similar traces." "But what about the possibility of strychnine?" "Yes, definitely." Holmes took notes. "Thank you, Dr. Ashe." By evening, Holmes had spread the evidence he had gathered across the table. Watson was sitting across from him. "Here's what we have," said Holmes, listing the evidence one by one. "First, the poisoned cup. We found traces of strychnine on the inside surface of the judge's cup. The other cups are clean. Second, the rat poison box. In the basement storage room, a half-empty box. The source of the strychnine. Third, Alice's access to the kitchen. While Mrs. Garrett was in the spice cabinet, Alice was alone in the kitchen. She was alone with the cups. Fourth, Alice's chemistry education. She wrote a thesis on alkaloid poisons at Cambridge. She has knowledge of strychnine extraction. Fifth, chemistry notes. Notes on strychnine written 3 years after university. A planned preparation. Sixth, fingerprints. Dr. Ash confirmed that the prints were caused by contact with an alkaloid, likely strychnine. Seventh, motivation. Eleanor's diary. Alice knew her father had killed her mother. Watson examined the evidence. It looks like a strong case. Holmes shook his head. It does, but a lawyer could pick each one apart. The bowl, someone else could have poisoned it. The box, anyone could have accessed it. The kitchen. Being alone for a few minutes isn't a crime. The chemistry notes, academic curiosity. The fingerprints, not conclusive evidence. The diary, knowing isn't doing. Watson frowned. Then what will we do? Holmes stood up and walked to the window. We need definitive proof, irrefutable proof. We need to catch Alice trying to destroy the evidence. Watson understood. You're setting a trap. Holmes turned around. Yes. Tomorrow I'll tell Alice that the evidence will be examined tomorrow, and that night we'll watch the mansion. Watson asked thoughtfully, what if she doesn't fall into the trap? What if she tries to destroy the evidence? Holmes smiled. Alice is meticulous, Watson. She's planned everything. But she hasn't disposed of the evidence yet because she thought no one suspected her. When suspicion arises, her instincts will give her away. Holmes leaned against the fireplace. Alice is clever, but cleverness can sometimes be a trap. Very clever people think they can control everything, and that thought leads them astray. Watson stood up. So what will we do tomorrow? Holmes explained his plan. Tomorrow morning I'll go to the mansion. I'll talk to Alice. I'll tell her this. Tomorrow, Lestrade and I will thoroughly examine the cellar. I've requested some records from Cambridge. I sent the jars to the lab. The results will be in tomorrow. Holmes paused. While saying this, I'll watch Alice's face, and we'll watch the mansion that night. If Alice tries to destroy the evidence, the rat poison box, the chemistry notes, maybe her mother's diary, she'll hide or burn them. We'll catch her red-handed. Watson nodded. A dangerous plan. Holmes shrugged. Detective work is sometimes dangerous, Watson, but this is the only way to convict Alice. Circumstantial evidence isn't enough. We need to catch her red-handed. That night, Holmes reviewed his plan until late. He calculated every detail, evaluated every possibility. When Watson went to bed, Holmes was still sitting in front of the fireplace, his eyes fixed on the flames. Alice was clever. Holmes knew that. But cleverness alone wasn't enough. Alice was also emotional. Her mother's death had consumed her for years, burning her with a fire of vengeance. And emotional people made mistakes under pressure. Holmes lit his pipe and watched the smoke rings. Tomorrow, he said to himself, tomorrow, everything will end. Chapter 6. The Trap. Early in the morning, Holmes set off with Watson for Pemberton Manor. The sky was cloudy, but it wasn't raining. It was late November and winter was approaching. The trees had shed their leaves. The gardens were bare. When the carriage stopped in front of the mansion, Holmes glanced outside for a moment. The building looked as gloomy as ever. Grey stones, long windows, a pointed roof. But today was different. Holmes was coming to this house for the last time. Tonight, everything would end. "Let's go over the plan one more time," said Holmes before stepping out of the carriage. Watson nodded. "You'll talk to Alice. You'll make her feel that you suspect her. You'll tell her that the evidence will be examined tomorrow." "Right, but I won't accuse her directly. I'll just leave clues. Alice is smart. She'll piece them together herself. And she'll sense the danger." Watson asked thoughtfully, "What if Alice doesn't fall for the trap? What if she stays calm and does nothing?" Holmes smiled slightly. "Then we'll proceed with the circumstantial evidence we have. But I don't think Alice will stay calm. She's someone who's used to controlling everything. When she feels she's lost control, she'll act." Holmes got out of the carriage. "You wait here, Watson. I'll be inside for about an hour. Then we'll leave together. But we'll return tonight." Watson nodded. "Be careful, Holmes." Holmes didn't respond. He simply walked toward the mansion's door. Alice was in the sitting room. She was sitting in the armchair by the window, watching outside. She was dressed in black, still in mourning. Or at least that's how it appeared. When Holmes entered, Alice turned her head. There was no surprise on her face, as if she had been expecting him. "Mr. Holmes," she said in a calm voice. "Welcome back. These visits of yours are becoming a habit." Holmes smiled slightly. "I hope I'm not disturbing you, Miss Pemberton. I just wanted to share a few updates." Alice raised her eyebrows. "Update?" Holmes sat down in the chair opposite him. He tried to look relaxed, but his eyes were carefully watching Alice's face. "The investigation is progressing," Holmes said slowly. "Tomorrow, Inspector Lestrade and I will thoroughly examine the basement storage room. We hope to find interesting things there." Alice's face didn't change, but Holmes caught a flicker in her eyes, very brief, a fraction of a second. "The basement?" Alice asked in a calm voice. "What do you hope to find there?" "I don't know yet, but we'll examine every corner, every box, every shelf." Holmes paused and pulled a piece of paper from his pocket. He glanced at it, then put it back in his pocket. "I also requested some records from Cambridge University, graduates' thesis topics, lecture notes, that sort of thing. They should arrive in a few days." Alice's hands twitched slightly. She clenched the fingers she had clasped in her lap. "Cambridge? Why?" Holmes shrugged. "Routine. Research. Sometimes the most interesting clues come from the most unexpected places." Holmes stood up and walked to the window. He looked outside. "There are also the bowls, of course. I sent the bowls I took from the dining room to the lab. They're doing chemical analysis. The results will be in tomorrow." Holmes turned and looked at Alice. "Strychnine is an interesting poison, you know. It dissolves in water, becomes invisible when dry, but it leaves a trace. It always leaves a trace." Alice's face had paled, but her voice remained calm. "You're conducting a very, very thorough investigation, Mr. Holmes." Holmes smiled. "That's my job, Miss Pemberton, to find the truth." Holmes walked toward the door, but he stopped at the threshold and turned around. "Ah, one more thing. Your mother's diary. I'm keeping that as evidence too. It's a very illuminating document. I'll give it to Lestrade tomorrow." Alice didn't respond. She just looked at Holmes. There was something in her. Eyes, fear, anger, or calculation. It was hard to say. Holmes bowed his head. "Good day, Miss Pemberton." And he left. Watson was waiting inside the carriage. When Holmes got in, Watson's face was curious. How did it go? Holmes looked out the window at the mansion. I planted the seed. Now we'll wait for it to grow. How did Alice react? She tried to appear calm, but her eyes gave her away. Every time I gave a clue, the basement, Cambridge, the bowls, I saw a calculation in her eyes. Alice is thinking right now. She's deciding what to do. Holmes turned. We're returning to the mansion tonight, but secretly. We'll watch what Alice does. When night fell, Holmes and Watson returned to the mansion. This time they didn't use a carriage. They came quietly, on foot. The moon was behind the clouds. It was a dark and foggy night. Holmes had made preparations beforehand. He had returned to the mansion that afternoon and slightly loosened the lock on the kitchen door. Now they could enter through that door. They approached the back of the mansion. Holmes put a finger to his lips, a sign for silence. Watson nodded. They hid behind some bushes in the garden. From here they could see the rear of the mansion, the kitchen door, the basement windows, and the windows of the bedrooms upstairs. "We'll wait," Holmes whispered. "If Alice is going to do anything, she'll do it after midnight, after everyone is asleep." Watson tried to warm himself with his coat. The night was cold and waiting was difficult. But he had waited years beside Holmes. He was accustomed to this kind of patience operation. Hours passed. The mansion was dark. All the lights were out. Occasionally an owl hooted. The wind rustled the trees. There was no other sound. It was past midnight. Watson had begun to doze off. But Holmes's eyes were open. He was watching the mansion intently. And then it happened. A light flickered on in an upstairs window. A faint, trembling light. Candlelight. Holmes touched Watson's arm. "Look," he whispered. Watson blinked and looked. The light was coming from Alice's room. A few minutes later, the light moved. It shifted from window to window. Then it vanished. "It went out into the corridor," said Holmes. "It's coming downstairs." Holmes and Watson waited. A few minutes later, a faint light appeared in the kitchen window. Then it too disappeared. "The basement," said Holmes. He went down to the basement. Holmes stood up. "Now," he said, "we're going." They approached the kitchen door quietly. Holmes pushed the door slowly. The lock, which he had loosened beforehand, opened easily. They went inside. The kitchen was dark and silent. A few embers still glowed in the corner of the stove, giving off a faint light. Holmes took a candle from his pocket but did not light it. He preferred to proceed in the darkness. They approached the basement stairs. A faint light came from below. Alice was there. Holmes descended the stairs slowly. He paused at each step, careful not to make a sound. Watson followed behind. They stopped in the basement corridor. The door to the storage room was ajar, and candlelight was seeping out from inside. Holmes approached the door and looked inside. Alice was there. The young woman was standing in the middle of the storage room. She held a candle. Her face looked pale and shadowed in the candlelight. A sack stood in front of her, and Alice was putting something into it. Holmes looked more closely. He saw what Alice had in her hands, a box of rat poison, and next to it, on the floor, were chemistry notes, notes written after she had left university. Alice took the notes and placed them next to the sack. Then she pulled a matchbox from her pocket. She was preparing to light it. Holmes stepped out of the darkness. "Miss Pemberton." Alice froze. The matchbox in her hand remained suspended in the air. She turned around. When she saw Holmes, her face went pale. Her eyes widened. Shock, fear, and a momentary panic. But then she composed herself. The expression on her face changed from panic to a cold acceptance. "Mr. Holmes," she said slowly, "I wasn't expecting you." Holmes took a few steps forward. Watson followed him in and closed the door. "No, you weren't expecting me," Holmes said calmly. "But I was expecting you." Alice looked around. The sack, the box, the notes, everything was out in the open. She was caught, both by the evidence and by her attempt to destroy it. Alice dropped the box on the floor, the notes too. She leaned against the wall. A long silence followed. "How long have you known?" Alice finally asked. "I've suspected since I found the bowl. I was certain when I saw the marks on your fingers." Alice looked at her hands, those pale yellowish marks, the marks left by strychnine. "Carelessness," Alice said to herself. "I should have worn gloves, but I was in a hurry." Holmes approached. "Why didn't you just say so? Why did you play this game?" "Because I couldn't convict you with circumstantial evidence," said Holmes. "I knew someone as clever as you would try to destroy the evidence under threat, and I was right." Alice shook her head with a bitter smile. "Yes, you were right. You were right about everything." Alice leaned against the wall and slid to the floor. She sat down, legs crossed, hands in her lap. For the first time, she looked vulnerable, but she wasn't crying. "Do you want to know?" Alice asked in a low voice. "How it happened? Why it happened?" Holmes shook his head. "Tell me." Alice took a deep breath. 2 years ago, I was rummaging through my mother's room. I wanted to touch her things. I wanted to remember her, and I found the diary. Alice paused. Her eyes looked into the distance. I read it. I read every word. I learned what my mother had been through, that she had been beaten for years, that she wanted to escape. And that night, what happened that night? Alice's voice hardened. My father killed my mother. He pushed her down the stairs, and no one did anything. The police closed the case. The judge was a judge. Who could judge him? Alice looked at Holmes. "I judged him, Mr. Holmes. Even 10 years later, I judged him." Holmes listened silently. "When did you make the plan?" "After I found the diary, but not immediately. I thought about it first. I researched it. I remembered what I learned at Cambridge. Strychnine. It was a perfect poison. Hard to detect, easy to administer." Alice continued. "I found the rat poison box in the basement. I knew Dr. Ash's prescription. I extracted the strychnine. A simple process. Anyone with chemistry knowledge could do it. I put it in the bowl. And I waited." "How did you know the maid's serving habits?" Alice smiled slightly. "I've lived in this house for 25 years, Mr. Holmes. Mary always serves the same way. Clockwise. The first bowl goes to my father. You'd have to be blind not to know that." Holmes nodded. "And the date on the napkin? March 12th, 1885? Alice's face darkened. "My mother's death date. I wanted my father to know. Before she died, I wanted him to know why she died. That date, it was a message for him, a I know message." A long silence fell. Watson looked at Alice. The young woman no longer looked like a murderer, but like a lost child. A child who had lost her mother, hated her father, and taken justice into her own hands. Holmes pulled a whistle from his pocket. "Inspector Lestrade is waiting outside," he said. "I need to call him." Alice nodded. "I know." Holmes blew the whistle. A few minutes later, footsteps could be heard. Lestrade and 2 police officers came down the basement stairs. Lestrade paused when he saw Alice. The young woman was still sitting on the floor, her hands in her lap. Miss Pemberton, Lestrade said in a formal voice, I am arresting you on suspicion of the murder of Judge Harold Pemberton. Alice stood up. She extended her hands to the officers. As the handcuffs were being applied, Alice said one last thing, more of an explanation than a confession. My father killed my mother. For 10 years, no one did anything. I did. As Alice was taken away, Holmes remained in the basement. He looked at the evidence left on the floor. A rat poison box, chemistry notes. And he noticed something else. A small photo that had fallen out of Alice's pocket. Holmes picked up the photo and looked at it. In the photo, a young woman was smiling. Eleanor. Alice had carried her mother's photo with her that night. Holmes put the photo in his pocket. Watson, he said in a low voice, we're leaving. Our work here is done. Watson looked at his friend's face. There was a strange expression on Holmes's face. Not triumph, but sadness. The case was solved, but there was no winner. As they climbed the basement stairs, Watson asked, Holmes, are you okay? Holmes didn't answer. He just walked to the mansion's door and stepped out into the night. The moon had emerged from behind the clouds. A cold, white light illuminated the garden. Holmes took a deep breath. We'll sort everything out tomorrow, Watson. But now, let's go home. Chapter 7. Justice. 3 days had passed since Alice Pemberton's arrest. The London newspapers had carried the story on their front pages. Retired judge's daughter arrested as murder suspect. The news was being discussed in every corner of the city. In coffee houses, clubs, and on the streets, people were discussing the judge's death and his daughter's arrest. At 221 B. Baker Street, however, the atmosphere was different. Holmes was sunk into his chair in front of the fireplace, lost in thought. Eleanor's diary lay on the table. Holmes had not yet given it to Lestrade. Watson recognized this state in his friend. When Holmes solved a case, he usually relaxed, his energy waned, and he would sometimes sleep for days. But this time was different. Holmes had not relaxed. Something was troubling him. Holmes, Watson finally said, you've been silent for 3 days. What are you thinking? Holmes fixed his eyes on the diary. I'm thinking about justice, Watson, and the limits of the law. Watson furrowed his brow. What do you mean? Holmes stood up and walked to the window. There are 2 murders in this case. One committed by Alice, poisoning her father. The other committed by the judge 10 years ago, pushing his wife down the stairs. I've only been able to solve one. The other remains unpunished. Watson understood. Eleanor's death. It was never investigated. It wasn't investigated because the judge was a judge, a powerful, influential man. The police closed the case. Constable Briggs saw the bruises but didn't write them in the report. Dr. Ashe knew about the violence for years, but kept quiet. Everyone kept quiet. Holmes turned. Alice did what the law couldn't. She took justice into her own hands. Now she will be tried for murder. But the judge, he was never tried. He will never be tried. Watson asked thoughtfully, This bothers you? It does, because it's not fair. Alice is a murderer. Yes, that's true. But her father was a murderer too, and the law punished one while ignoring the other. Holmes walked to the table and took the diary. At least I can do something. I can make sure Eleanor's story is known. I can make sure the judge's true face is revealed. Watson understood. Are you going to give the diary to the press? Holmes shook his head. To the Times. They're a reliable newspaper. They'll tell the story accurately. The next day, Holmes met with the editor of the Times. He gave him selected passages from Eleanor's diary, the most striking, the most heartbreaking pages. The editor read the diary carefully and looked at Holmes. "Is this true, Mr. Holmes? Did Judge Pemberton really abuse his wife?" "It's true. The diary is in Eleanor's own handwriting. Additionally, Constable Briggs, a police officer from that time, can also testify. He saw the bruises on Eleanor's arms but didn't mention them in his report." The editor thought, this would be a major story. The claim that a retired judge killed his wife? It would cause a public uproar. Holmes shook his head. "The public needs to know. Alice Pemberton will be tried for her father, but her father was never tried for her mother. I want this injustice to at least be known." The editor nodded. "We'll publish it tomorrow." The next day, the Times ran the story on the front page. The judge's dark secret, Eleanor Pemberton's diary, revealed. In the words of the woman who died 10 years ago, "One day he will kill me." The news had a bombshell effect in London. People were horrified as they read excerpts from the diary. Eleanor's years of suffering, violence, fear, all described in her own words. And the most terrifying, "One day he will kill me. I know it." Public opinion was divided. Some condemned Alice. Murder is murder, no matter the reason. But the vast majority sympathized with Alice. The question, who judges the judge, began to be debated in newspapers, on the streets, in Parliament. Holmes smiled slightly as he read the newspapers. At least Eleanor's story was known. At least the judge's true face had been revealed. Holmes took another step besides writing in his diary. He had retired Constable Briggs' testimony officially recorded. Briggs came to Scotland Yard and recounted what he knew about Eleanor's death. The bruises on her arms, details not mentioned in the report, pressure from above. After listening to the testimony, Lestrade looked at Holmes. "This tarnishes the judge's name," he said, "but we can't try a dead man." "I know," said Holmes, "but at least let it be on record. History should know what the judge did." Lestrade shook his head. "You're a strange man, Holmes. You solved the case, caught the killer, but you're still not satisfied." Holmes didn't respond. He just looked out the window. Holmes visited George Whitfield the next day. Whitfield had become even more withdrawn since the judge's death. He was sitting in his office, looking at his brother's photograph. When Holmes entered, Whitfield looked up. "Mr. Holmes, I heard you caught the judge's daughter. Congratulations." Holmes sat down. "I need to tell you something, Mr. Whitfield, about your brother Edward." Whitfield's eyes lit up. "Edward? What about him?" Holmes pulled a piece of paper from his pocket. "I reviewed some old files during the investigation, including Edward Whitfield's case, and I found some irregularities." Whitfield leaned forward. "What kind of irregularities?" "Evidence tampering. The main evidence that convicted Edward, the fingerprint on the murder weapon, has some inconsistencies in the file. The date on the fingerprint report predates the date the weapon was found. That's impossible." Whitfield's face changed. "What do you mean?" "I mean that someone may have tampered with the evidence, and Judge Pemberton was the judge presiding over this case. He accepted the evidence, guided the jury." Whitfield was trembling. So Edward was really innocent, and the judge knew it? Holmes took a deep breath. "I can't say for certain, but the files raise suspicions. If you wish, you can initiate legal proceedings to clear your brother's name." Whitfield wiped his eyes. The anger and pain he had been holding inside for years were now transforming into something else. Hope. "Thank you, Mr. Holmes. I'll do it. I'll clear Edward's name." Holmes stood up. "I hope you succeed, Mr. Whitfield." As he stood at the door, Whitfield asked, "Mr. Holmes, the judge, was the judge really a bad man?" Holmes turned around. "I suppose everyone is a little good and a little bad, Mr. Whitfield, but some people are better at hiding their badness. The judge was one of them." Holmes also visited Dr. Ashe. This would be their final meeting. Ashe was sitting in his office. His desk was empty. He wasn't seeing patients. His face looked tired and aged. When Holmes entered, Ashe raised his head. "Mr. Holmes, I was expecting you." "Why?" Ashe took a deep breath. "Because I need to say something. To you and to myself." Holmes sat down. Ashe began to speak. "I saw Eleanor's bruises for years, at every checkup. She would say, 'I fell,' and I would write, 'bruise from a fall.' I knew she was lying. I knew Harold was abusing her. But I did nothing." Ashe's voice trembled. "I was a coward, Mr. Holmes. Harold was a powerful man. He was a judge. He could have ruined my career, so I kept quiet. I kept quiet for 30 years. Holmes listened in silence. "And then Eleanor died. They said she fell down the stairs. I didn't see the autopsy, but I knew. I knew Harold had killed her, and I stayed silent again." Ashe bowed his head. "Now, Alice is in prison, Eleanor's daughter, and I'm still here, free, innocent." Holmes remained silent for a moment. Then he spoke. "Silence is also a choice, Dr. Ashe, and every choice has a price." Ashe shook his head. "I know. That's why I'm closing my practice. I can't continue practicing medicine. I have no right to treat my patients." Holmes stood up. "That's your decision, Dr. Ashe. I didn't come here to judge you." As Ashe walked toward the door, he called out over his shoulder, "Mr. Holmes, was Alice a good girl?" Holmes turned around. "Alice was a girl who loved her mother, and someone who sought justice. I don't approve of her methods, but I understand her motivation." Holmes left. Dr. Ashe remained alone in his empty office. A week later, Catherine Hale went to Holloway Prison. She was going to visit Alice. The prison was a cold and gloomy place. Grey walls, iron bars, long corridors. Catherine waited in the visiting room. A few minutes later, Alice was brought in. Alice's face was pale, but she seemed calm. She had dark circles under her eyes. She probably hadn't been sleeping, but she wasn't broken. Catherine looked at her niece. Her eyes filled with tears. "Alice," she said in a hoarse voice. "Aunt Catherine." A long silence followed. There was so much to say, but the words wouldn't come. Finally, Catherine pulled a small object from her pocket, a photograph. "I brought this for you," she said. "It's a photo of your mother, taken when she was young." Alice took the photo. Her hands were trembling. She looked at the photo. Young Eleanor, beautiful and happy, before life's hardships had begun. And Alice cried. For the first time since she had been arrested. Tears streamed down her cheeks. She couldn't stop them. All the pain, anger, and loneliness she had been holding inside for years. It all poured out at once. Catherine reached out and took her niece's hand. "Your mother loved you very much," she said. "Very much. More than anything." Alice spoke between sobs. "I loved her too. I loved her very much too." Tears were streaming down Catherine's cheeks too. "I know, dear, I know." When visiting hours ended, the guards came. Alice stood up. She looked at Catherine one last time. "Aunt Catherine, I don't regret it. I wanted you to know that. I don't regret what I did. Catherine shook her head. I know, and I don't judge you either. Alice was taken away. As Catherine exited the prison gate, Watson was waiting for her. Holmes had asked him to. Watson looked at Catherine's face. The woman had been crying, but now she looked calm. How? Watson asked. Catherine took a deep breath. Strong, like Eleanor. Very strong. On Sunday, Reverend Thomas Eversley preached at St. Margaret's Church. The church was more crowded than usual. The judge's death and Alice's arrest had shaken the neighbourhood. Eversley stood at the pulpit and looked out at the congregation. Watson was there too. He had come at Holmes's request. Today, said Eversley, I wish to speak about justice and mercy. The congregation was silent. We all want justice. We want criminals punished, the innocent protected. But sometimes justice is complicated. Sometimes the line between the guilty and the innocent becomes blurred. Eversley paused. Consider a woman who has lost her mother, a woman who has seen her mother's killer go unpunished, and finally, a woman who has taken justice into her own hands. Is this woman guilty? Yes. But at the same time, isn't she also a victim? The congregation stirred. Some shook their heads, others frowned. I won't give you an answer today, because the answer isn't with me. The answer is in each of your hearts. What is justice? What is mercy? These questions aren't easy, and they don't have easy answers. Eversley clasped his hands. But I know this. God sees us all, our sins and our pain. And one day we will all give account before him. Then true justice will be served. When the sermon ended, the church was silent. No one spoke. Watson pondered Eversley's words. What is justice? What is mercy? They were truly difficult questions. The trial began 6 weeks later. Alice Pemberton was tried for murder. The whole of London was following the case. The prosecutor claimed Alice was a cold-blooded killer. She had planned it for months, carefully administered the poison, and killed her father. This was first-degree murder. The defense attorney painted a different picture. He read from Eleanor's diary, the years of suffering, the violence, the fear. He explained that the judge had killed his wife, that the police had covered up the case, that the law had failed to deliver justice. Alice had been forced to take justice into her own hands. The jury deliberated for days. Public opinion was divided. Some wanted Alice to be executed. Murder is murder. Others wanted her to be pardoned. She is a victim, not a murderer. Finally, the jury reached a verdict. The verdict was published in the newspapers. People read it, debated it, commented on it. But the real verdict, whether justice had been served, remained in everyone's conscience. When Watson told Holmes about the court's decision, Holmes merely shook his head. The law has made its decision, said Holmes. But justice is something else, Watson. And sometimes the law and justice don't walk through the same door. It was evening. The fireplace was burning at 221 B. Baker Street. Holmes and Watson sat facing each other, silently watching the fire. Watson was writing up the case. As he reviewed his notes, he asked Holmes, "Holmes, do you think justice has been served?" Holmes lit his pipe. As smoke rings rose to the ceiling, he looked out the window. There was fog over London, as usual. A long silence followed. Law and justice don't always enter through the same door, Watson, Holmes finally said. Sometimes one goes in while the other stays outside. In this case, I don't know which one is inside and which one is outside. Watson wrote down these words. Then he asked, "Well, what about you? How do you feel? This case, it's affected you, hasn't it?" Holmes put down his pipe. "It has," he said slowly, "because this was no simple case. It wasn't just the capture of a murderer. This was a family tragedy. It was the story of a woman's years of suffering. It was the story of a daughter seeking revenge for her mother." Holmes turned and looked at Watson. "I'm a detective, Watson. Finding the truth is my job, but sometimes the truth hurts. In this case, I found the truth, but finding it wasn't enough, because the truth came 10 years too late." Watson understood. "Eleanor, if someone had found the truth 10 years ago, Alice wouldn't have been a murderer. Eleanor might still be alive, and the judge would have served his sentence." Holmes looked at the fireplace. But no one searched, no one asked. Everyone remained silent. And silence is the greatest accomplice, Watson. A long silence fell over the room. The logs in the fireplace crackled. Outside, the wind was beating against the window. Watson put down his pen. "How should I end this story, Holmes? There's no happy ending." Holmes smiled slightly. "There isn't always a happy ending, Watson. But the real ending is important. And the truth is, Alice told her mother's story to the world. Eleanor will never be forgotten. And maybe this will change something. Maybe one day when another Eleanor is abused, someone won't remain silent." Watson wrote down these words. A beautiful thought. It's not a thought, Watson. It's hope, and hope. Hope is everything. Holmes stood up and walked to the window. He looked out at London's misty silhouette. Tomorrow is a new day, Watson. New cases, new mysteries. But tonight let us remember Eleanor and Alice, and the importance of not staying silent. Watson closed his notebook. The story was over. But some stories never end. They just continue. In other people's lives, at other times, in other ways. And perhaps one day, someone will read this story, and something will change. Maybe.